Rachelle sat quietly in her car, gripping the steering wheel tighter than she needed to. The coastal road wound lazily before her, the sun glinting off the ocean waves as they crashed against the rocks far below. Safe Harbour, the small town she was driving toward, was supposed to be a refuge. But as she drove deeper into its heart, the dread inside her only intensified. It had been a year since Dan had died. A whole year since the light in her world had been snuffed out by that terrible accident. The man she had planned to spend her life with was gone, leaving behind an emptiness that felt as vast as the ocean before her. Now, she had nothing but the memories, and those were both a blessing and a curse. The town's welcome sign appeared, weathered and familiar. It marked the beginning of something, though she wasn't sure what that something was. Maybe this quiet, isolated place would help her find a way to live again. Or maybe it would remind her too much of the life she had lost. Her rented cottage stood on a small bluff, overlooking the sea. It was small, rustic, and peaceful. But as Rachelle stepped inside and dropped her bags to the floor, the silence felt overwhelming. She couldn't help but think of how Dan would have loved this place. The sound of the waves, the smell of the ocean air. It would have been their escape, their sanctuary. But now it was just hers. She wandered through the rooms, touching the weathered wood of the kitchen counter, the smooth surface of the small dining table. Each gesture felt like reaching out to a ghost, one that lingered just out of reach. The cottage, though charming, felt too big for one person, its quiet too oppressive. There was no laughter here, no warm embrace at the end of the day. Just her, and the unending tide of grief that followed her everywhere. Rachelle collapsed onto the couch, staring out the window. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the sea. The beauty of it hurt. It reminded her of the sunsets she used to watch with Dan, how they'd sit on the porch of their home, his arm wrapped around her, his voice a soft murmur against the backdrop of the setting sun. Now, all she had was the memory of him. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't bother wiping it away. David stood by the docks, watching the boats as they bobbed gently in the water. His hands were calloused from years of hard work, his face weathered by the sun and wind. He had lived in Safe Harbour all his life, and it showed. The ocean was in his blood. It had given him peace when nothing else could. He lived alone in a house just outside of town, a house that once echoed with the sounds of another life, another love. Emily, his late wife, had passed away years ago, but the pain of her absence was still fresh, as if it had just happened yesterday. Like the tide, it came and went in waves. Some days, he could almost forget how deep his sorrow ran. Other days, it hit him like a storm, threatening to pull him under. Today was one of the quiet days, the kind where he kept his head down, did his work, and tried not to think too much. But even in the peaceful rhythm of the sea, he couldn't escape the loneliness that had taken root in his heart. It was a part of him now, something he had learned to live with. As he wiped his hands on a rag, a movement caught his eye. A woman, walking along the shore, her head bowed as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. He didn't know her, but something about her drew him in. She looked lost, not just in direction, but in life. He understood that feeling too well. She passed by without noticing him, her steps slow, deliberate. David watched her disappear down the beach, a strange sense of familiarity washing over him. He didn't know her story, but he had a feeling it was one of loss, just like his. Later in town, David overheard talk of a newcomer, a woman renting the old cliffside cottage. He didn't ask questions, but the pieces fit. She was running from something, just like him. Rachelle was having a terrible day. The waves outside her cottage were rough, and the wind had picked up, rattling the windows like they were about to break. It was as if the storm brewing outside mirrored the storm inside her. She had hoped that Safe Harbour would bring some measure of peace, but instead, it had unearthed emotions she'd tried to bury. She was so tired of grieving, tired of feeling lost, tired of being alone. She decided to head into town to distract herself. Her car had been giving her trouble for days, and she needed supplies from the market anyway. But halfway to town, it broke down completely. She cursed under her breath, stepping out into the wind to check the engine, as if she would know what to do. Dan had always been the one to handle things like this, and the sudden realization of how much she relied on him hit her like a punch to the gut. Before she could let the frustration overwhelm her, she heard the low rumble of a truck pulling up behind her. David stepped out, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to her rising panic. She recognized him from the beach, though they hadn't spoken before. His presence was steady, like the ocean itself, and for some reason, it made her feel a little less frantic. "You need help?" he asked, his voice rough but kind. Rachelle hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, my car I don't know what's wrong with it." David inspected the engine with quiet focus, and after a few moments, he looked up at her. "I can tow it back to town if you'd like. There's a shop there that'll take a look." Rachelle wanted to protest, to insist she could handle it on her own, but the truth was she couldn't. "Not right now. Thank you," she said softly. As they rode back into town, the silence between them felt strangely comfortable. It wasn't like the oppressive loneliness she had felt in the cottage, but rather a shared silence, one that spoke of mutual understanding. She didn't ask him why he was helping her, and he didn't offer any explanation. But as the town came into view, Rachelle felt a small glimmer of gratitude, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Days passed, and though Rachelle and David's interactions remained brief, something had shifted. Every time she saw him, whether it was at the market or during her walks along the beach, there was a quiet acknowledgement between them. It wasn't much, just a nod or a small smile, but it was enough to make Rachelle feel a little less alone. One afternoon, Rachelle found herself walking along the cliffs again, drawn to the sea like it held the answers to her grief. The wind whipped at her hair, and for a moment, she felt untethered, like she could be swept away at any moment. But then she saw David, down by the docks, working on his boat. Something about his steady presence anchored her, and without thinking, she made her way down to him. David looked up as she approached, surprise flickering in his eyes. She had never come to him before, and for a moment, neither of them knew what to say. But then Rachelle spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Do you ever feel like you'll never be whole again?" she asked, her words raw and vulnerable. David studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "Every day." The honesty in his words hit her like a wave, and for the first time since Dan's death, Rachelle felt a sense of connection. David understood her pain in a way no one else could, and in that moment, she realized that maybe she didn't have to carry it all alone. The two of them stood there, side by side, watching the sea. The wind howled around them, but for the first time in a long time, Rachelle felt a flicker of hope. The storm had come suddenly, turning what had been a peaceful afternoon into a raging tempest. Rachelle had been walking along the cliffs, lost in thought, when the wind started to howl and the rain began to pour. She hadn't meant to wander so far from the cottage, but once again, the sea had drawn her in. It was as if the waves spoke to her grief, their wildness matching the turmoil inside her. She tried to hurry back, but the rain had made the path slick, and before she knew it, her foot slipped on the wet stones. Pain shot through her ankle as she tumbled to the ground, the wind whipping her hair into her face. For a moment, she lay there, gasping for breath, the storm raging around her. Panic rose in her chest as she realized she couldn't put weight on her injured ankle. She was stranded. A mixture of frustration and fear gripped her. The rain was relentless, and the cliffs were dangerously close. Rachelle shivered, both from the cold and the overwhelming sense of helplessness. She couldn't call for help. There was no one nearby. Or at least, that's what she thought, until she heard footsteps approaching. Through the blur of rain and wind, a figure emerged. David. He had been nearby, working on his boat when the storm hit. The moment he saw her fall, he rushed to her side without hesitation. His strong, weathered hands reached out, and despite the pain and fear swirling inside her, Rachelle felt a strange sense of relief. He was here. "Can you stand?" His voice was firm but calm, and it grounded her in the midst of her panic. I don't think so," Rachelle managed to say, her voice shaking as she tried to sit up. David knelt beside her, his eyes scanning her ankle before nodding slightly. "It looks like a sprain. I'll carry you back." Before she could protest, He scooped her into his arms, lifting her effortlessly. The warmth of his body against hers was comforting, despite the cold rain that soaked them both. As he carried her away from the cliffs and back toward his house, Rachelle's mind raced. She wasn't used to needing help. After Dan's death, she had built walls around herself, determined to survive on her own. But now, here she was leaning on someone else, literally. David didn't say much as they made their way to his house, and Rachelle was grateful for the silence. She wasn't ready to talk, not yet. She wasn't even sure what to say. His home was simple, but inviting. The moment they stepped inside, the warmth of the fireplace hit her, and Rachelle shivered again. This time from the sudden contrast between the storm outside and the safety inside. David set her down gently on the couch, then disappeared for a moment before returning with a blanket and a hot cup of tea. "Here," he said quietly, draping the blanket around her shoulders and handing her the tea. "This should help." Rachelle wrapped her fingers around the mug, letting the heat seep into her cold skin. She watched as David moved around the room, his actions careful and deliberate. It was clear he was used to taking care of things on his own, just like she was. The room was sparsely decorated, but there were small touches, photos, books, mementos, that hinted at a life that had once been fuller, richer. A life that had been shared with someone. For the first time, Rachelle allowed herself to wonder about David's past. She had sensed the sadness in him from the beginning, but now, sitting here in his home, surrounded by the quiet echoes of a life he had lost, she realized how much they had in common. They were both broken, both trying to find their way in a world that no longer felt the same. As the storm raged outside, Rachelle and David sat in silence. But it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of strangers. It was the kind of silence that came from understanding, from shared grief. And for the first time since Dan's death, Rachelle didn't feel quite so alone. Days passed, and though Rachelle's ankle slowly healed, something deeper had begun to change inside her. The storm that had brought her and David together also seemed to have cleared the way for something new. Their connection, once unspoken and tentative, had begun to grow into something more. Rachelle found herself drawn to David in ways she hadn't expected. At first, it was just his steady presence that made her feel safe. But as they spent more time together, walking along the beach, sharing quiet meals, working side by side on small tasks around the cottage, she began to see the man behind the grief. David was kind, thoughtful, and strong in a way that went beyond physical strength. He had endured his own losses, but he hadn't let them destroy him. One evening, as they sat on the porch of Rachelle's cottage, watching the sun set over the ocean, she turned to him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Do you ever think about moving on?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible above the sound of the waves. David was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and filled with a quiet sadness. "I don't know," he admitted. "There are days when I feel like I'm ready, like I could open myself up to something new. But then there are days when it feels like the past is all I have left." Rachelle nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She had felt the same way for so long. But lately, being with David had made her wonder if there was more to life than just surviving. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for happiness again. The thought scared her. Loving someone again meant opening herself up to the possibility of more pain. But as she looked at David, she realized that the risk might be worth it. "I think," Rachelle hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I think we both deserve to be happy again." David turned to her, his gaze intense. "Do you really believe that?" She nodded, her heart racing. "Yes, I do." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken emotions. Then, without warning, David reached out and took her hand in his. His touch was warm and steady, and it sent a shiver through Rachelle that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. "I don't know if I'm ready," he said quietly, "but I think I want to try." Rachelle's heart swelled with hope. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a start, and that was more than enough for now. As the weeks turned into months, Rachelle and David grew closer. Their connection deepened, not just through shared grief, but through the small, everyday moments that began to fill their days. They learned to laugh again, to find joy in the simple things: a walk on the beach, a shared meal, a quiet evening by the fire. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments when the past would creep in, when the memories of Dan and Emily would pull them back into the darkness. But they faced those moments together, and slowly, the darkness began to lift. One afternoon, Rachelle finished a painting she had been working on for weeks. It was a seascape, the waves crashing against the cliffs in a wild, beautiful dance. As she stepped back to admire her work, she felt a sense of pride she hadn't felt in a long time. Painting had always been her passion, but after Dan's death, she had lost the desire to create. Now, though, it felt like she was coming back to life, like she was finding herself again. David stood behind her, watching her silently. When she turned to face him, he smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made her heart skip a beat. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice full of admiration. Rachelle smiled back, her heart full of warmth. "Thank you. I think I'm finally ready to let go of the past." David nodded, stepping closer to her. "Me too." And in that moment, Rachelle knew they had both found their safe harbor. Not in the town, but in each other. Hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential so that we can continue to bring you more incredible stories. Share it with your friends to help our channel grow. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.